Right. Welcome to folks who are joining via the recording. We will be talking about an issue raised a couple of weeks ago by Ethan. I'll share my screen. Otherwise, the video is very boring. It's maybe not super interesting, but it's better than a black screen. So last time we talked about types and how many different classifications we have, some of which we need to be more specific and standardized about, and some are so broad that we can't make even recommendations about which types to use because there are so many different types of coin in Ethan's case. So carrying on from that discussion, it seems like the next step is when should we use the types of types pattern such that consumers of the data know that this particular type is being used as a nationality when that type comes from a very long list that they can't possibly know in advance, or even genders. Right? If it was just male, female, then okay, that you can encode. But given the plurality of genders, having this type as a gender is super helpful, and so on. So I think we should look at what types of types we are using, and whether it's useful to further classify them. So for nationality versus gender, that helps a consuming agent to be able to search for people that have a gender or people that have a nationality without doing a huge union search of people that are classified as British, or people that are classified as English, or people that are classified as French, or ... So for that case, that's easy. But when else should we be using the pattern? Is it simply a sort of case by case as we run into them, or can we come to some sort of meta pattern or rule as to when we should use it and when we shouldn't? So that is, I think, the summary of the issue. And Ethan gave the example of, in the vocabulary in the community section, we talk about exchange media being coins or shells that are used to carry value, or dollar bills or whatever. But then he, of course, is at the Numismatic Society, has very, very specific types of coin, such as quinarius, or even further, this RRC 546/8 type of coin. So any thoughts on this as to when we should use types of types, or when types of types will provide value and clarity to the data, and when it's just extra noise?
Is there an exclusivity to the type of type specification? In the sense of, like, if you have this with the coin example, it seems like it would be fine to have a general, rather vague typology that only gets as far as coin. And if a numismatist is also interested in this object, they will provide in a different vocabulary, a much more specific, a different non-aligned, completely different vocabulary, their specific typology for that thing. So I don't know if they're in contradiction.
Yeah, I don't think there's any. I don't think there's exclusivity in that sense. Um, I think it's mostly the how to make sense of how does a machine make sense of the set of types in order to do something with them.
Like it would be helpful from the point of view of somebody who has more specialized knowledge to give them more general knowledge, um, rather than the other way around. But so, I mean, I think in that case, for example, and I haven't thought the whole issue through, but that having the specification, having a general specification, which only grabs a certain level of granularity but is useful to a wider audience, makes the model more useful, and is more implementable by people who have greater knowledge because they can just do a general pointing to all of my things are coins, which is a foolish thing to say because they're much more than that. But
I think to me, a lot of this is there's two things we're talking about. One is I have more specialized knowledge. How do I indicate that my specialized coin type is a narrower concept than a general purpose term? And I think, I think that Scoffs gives us lots of nice ways to do that, thing. I think to me, what this question feels more like is, given a very large set of terms, how do I indicate that I am using a subset of those terms in a context-specific way that has the potential to cross specific vocabularies? So to say that I'm using these 5 AAT terms for dimension types, but AAT doesn't have the concept of, say, diameter, so I'm using the Q unit concept for diameter, and all of these are of type, dimension. Or, I would like to have a more inclusive gender category, so I'm going to use these 2 AAT types, but also these 3 other terms from my custom gender vocabulary. And how do I group those into a single unit that a machine can say, oh, these types all belong together?
Yes. Yeah, these are all of these. This is a nationality, or this is a gender, and I agree that broader, narrower, we can just leave off. We can leave that to the vocabularies themselves, unless there's a particular need. But if we are pulling from multiple vocabularies, which I think for things like nationality and language and gender and so on is going to be essential, and also for just types of objects. AAT is pretty thorough, but as soon as you get down into culture-specific object types, it fizzles out. So the Autry here in Los Angeles, which is a Southwest museum, I'm certain has many more categories for its specialized area than AAT does. So how do we know that or do we even need to know that the classification is an object type rather than some other sort of classification when we don't know what the type is at the programmatic level?
I mean, isn't the standard vocabulary way they just say all of those are narrower types to another concept, and we use the vocabulary hierarchy to do that?
Well, I think that, and Antoine might know better than I do, I don't think it's necessarily narrower. So for example, if we have, I'll put this into the comments at the end, the vocabularies probably don't have the same structure, and aligning them like that is probably going to be quite difficult. As an example, we use classified as for the type of statement that it is, but we wouldn't want to say that the AET concept of materials is a statement, because it's not. We're just tagging the type as being sort of more about materials or about provenance. It's a provenance statement. It's not itself a provenance or a material. So we would introduce a lot of very, very messy, confusing data by using broader and narrower in this circumstance, and hence the type of the type is a little bit weaker. It's just saying, you know, here's a tag, semantic tag associated with this thing, but it doesn't specify a taxonomic relationship.
Yeah, but I think that's a different. I feel like we're talking about two different kinds of examples here. One is about more specialized knowledge that you want to associate with a more universal concept. And the other one is about creating domain-specific or application-specific subsets of vocabulary terms to be interpreted in that context.
Yes, but I think the same holds. No, that if we say that materials is narrower than statements, we have completely messed up the AET hierarchy.
Right. But materials is not narrower than statements, but I think what we're saying is that that sort of statement says these are the 5 types that we are using to tag vocabulary terms. Analyze these ones. That to me feels like a grouping of terms, not a classification of material as a concept. Because I feel like the statement, you know, the concept of material is a type of statement is also equally illogical. Because it's not, it's a concept.
Right.
And so, I mean, this is why I think I've been arguing for a collection pattern here, to say that this concept and this concept and this concept are logically grouped together in a bucket, and that bucket has type such and such. Which I think is this, you know, Anton was talking about the Scoss collection pattern, which is one way to do it. I think you and I had at one point talked about aggregations as another pattern to do this. But some way to say that I have conceptually grouped these things together, not saying they're a defined vocabulary, but saying that within the context of this environment, these are grouped together.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, and I think the reason, well, apart from historical, one of the reasons why we moved away from the groups was that they didn't give you sufficient information in the instance to be able to use it without having to potentially follow a bunch of links and find a huge list and see what that was, and hence it was much easier to reuse the classification pattern, which can just simply go into the data itself. But we have talked long enough. Anyone else have thoughts or opinions, comments, questions on?
My only comment here is, because I don't really have an opinion that's of any use, it's just that sometimes when we engage with this kind of in a detailed modeling effort, it might be useful to think about how we would intend to explain our eventual result, and to let that weigh a little bit in the debate.
Yeah,
How do we document these various choices?
Yeah, yeah. To me, that was one of the rationales for simply reusing the type pattern to say what sort of thing is this? Well, it's a nationality. Okay. Well, we have a way to say what sort of thing something is, which is typing.
Yeah, and if you want to be more subtle, and if you want to have like higher types or something, types of types, then how would that look in the documentation? How would we explain when to use it and when not to?
Yeah.
So
I think
you don't have to explain it.
I think my biggest worry here is when we start aggregating data here, because commonly used types are going to end up with many, many types, all of which will apply to all instances of that type.
I guess if you were to model it with passing through attribute assignment or something, you could throw away. I mean, obviously, you make the model more complicated, but then you would understand the context anyhow of the attribution of the type.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
That would be one possibility.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep. And the aggregation of data is a concern. I agree. However, all of them, unless you go into a lot of detail, result in the same global assertion that material is a statement and material is a physical concept and material is a something else. It's either in a set, or it is a thing, or it's been attributed by someone to be a thing. So you would need to be able to connect the attribution in George's example to the data set in which that attribution occurred, at which point we've suddenly reified our entire knowledge base. I don't think that the value in that case outweighs the complexity that would be added, particularly for something that's intended to make it easier to work with this particular data that the consuming application doesn't know about directly. And in an aggregated scenario, there are other techniques that we could potentially apply during aggregation.
I agree when we're talking about our own data. I feel like when we start making these assertions on other people's data, which is what we're typically doing when using vocabulary terms in classification, that makes me more nervous, because that is, classifying one of our objects as something feels like something appropriate. Classifying a widely used vocabulary term that will almost certainly be used in other people's data feels like a stronger thing to be doing.
I would say that part of the disagreement between you sounds to me like it's over whether we're trying to specify a common knowledge base, or whether we're trying to specify a way to publish data that could potentially be used to create, aggregate knowledge bases. Because if it's the former, then Rob's point about, let's don't reify ahead of ourselves, applies. And if it's the latter, then that's a question, that's a decision we leave to folks who actually create aggregations, because they can always step down from a system of pipes and kinds to something more straightforward. You can always knock precision out of, resolution out of the data. But which are we doing? Are we actually trying to build a giant common graph? Or are we building this specification that allows people to publish their data in ways that would allow people to build those common graphs for different purposes? And someone who's doing heavy provenance work may not want to knock that resolution out of the data. I'm thinking of folks here at SI. And then folks who are just trying to present a useful way to browse through a vast amount of art might very well say, that is totally useless to me. I want to get rid of it as soon as possible. I'm also thinking of people at SI.
And I guess my perspective would be that, and I'm aware of the time, we should do the easy one first, and then get people to think further about what happens when we aggregate it. This isn't, even if we were to be able to finalize everything tomorrow, it would not be the actual final, suits everyone, meets everyone's use cases version. Right? This is going to be a more than 6 month project, as I'm sure everyone is well aware. So I think getting something that builds adoption is relatively easy to implement, and then if people then start to aggregate it, then we can look at what happens in that scenario, and yeah, rather than trying to ensure that the data is as absolutely perfect as it possibly can be, but if it's perfect, then it's also very complicated. It needs to be implementable both by consumers and producers without tons of developer time or semantic engineering or so on. So I think unless there is a really strong, this just doesn't work, this blows away many things, I think this, as simple as possible, is the design principle that we need to be following. But it is the top of the hour, so I don't think there was any particular resolution on this one, but it's certainly a good discussion. And hopefully it's raised people's awareness and thinking about this sort of issue so that we can continue it, hopefully before the face-to-face, but certainly at the face-to-face if we haven't discussed it by then. So do everyone please work on your data, look at the issues. If you can map your data into the model and there are questions, raise them in Slack, make issues for them. And this is how we're going to be able to move forwards. So thank you, everyone. We'll have another call in a couple of weeks. I very much look forward to continuing these discussions. Right. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks.